All right, folks. So welcome to Link Digital's public forum. This is our third one of this type. We did customer forums prior to this. This public forum, we've got an awesome speaker. Do have a slide deck to bring on screen to go through some agenda stuff. So yeah, just basic introductions. Folks can jump in and introduce yourselves. If anyone would like to do that, I'm actually cool to do that after the topics because you might want to introduce yourself as you have a question anyway. So I would encourage anyone who's new, anyone who feels like they don't know everyone here, think of a question as we're going through some topics, as Jaimie and myself talk about a couple of things. And that way you can introduce yourself with context and present yourself with a great spotlight of how cool your question is. I went through about this forum and how we kind of take questions using the hands just earlier, but it is an opportunity for people to ask questions and raise their own topics as well. So we'll generally go through people's own topics towards the end. The two topics that we've got for today, one is government data are key to Canada's prosperous future from Jaimie. I'll let her introduce that whole topic, but I've had a read through it. Lots of topical topics within that topic. So people will have questions. There was anything that you might want to reflect on there. There's tons to think about. And then I'm just going to cover some of the stuff that Link Digital's been doing over the last, month and a half, pretty much. My kind of reflections on trips to Tallinn in Estonia for OGP, and then through to Toronto for a couple of events there. And what's next? Basically what that created in my mind, the hubris of an idea was formed, and I'm a bit optimistic about it, and that's going to roll into what's happening next for Link Digital, hopefully in the Canadian Open Data Summit. Then there's a couple of updates. We've been covering the OGP local and Australia's NAP3 stuff, so I'll talk about that. Open Data Summit in Canada, a couple of other things going on in Australia, and then again we'll have the open mic, so anyone can raise anything. Folks in the room, I've kind of gone through this already, so I don't have to go through it too much more. We've got basically product owners in the room as well. So in terms of people that we work with, we have product owners leading our work from Link Digital. And the other folks we've got here on the right-hand side, Andrew, Kate, and Kevin. I talked about them last time, the beginnings of a business services team, combined with a couple other people, helping us work out some public communications and engagements, not just within Australia and other markets, but sort of more globally and systematically around open data. One of the reasons I was keen for Andrew to come is just kind of put a spotlight on him. He's been doing a lot of cool work, doing literature reviews, reviewing policy around data and digital in Canada and Australia. And for those who might have noticed, there's been some good articles coming out on the Link Digital blog. I'd let people know they should check that out with some bias. And there's more to come. There's a positioning statement from Link, which is based on a literature review. It's been going on for a while. It will be out in the next some number of weeks once it's typeset. And it'll be competing with Jaimie's document around the future of digital and how everything's going to be awesome if we can govern it well and do things well. Not competing, it'll add to, it's all additive. About the forum we've covered. Now it's on to Jaimie. So Jaimie is awesome speaker on this subject. I've known Jaimie for some number of years, I think since 2018 at least, but I think it was before that with some open data conferences and such. Maybe it was Madrid. Anyway, quite a while. She's been a leader in digital and government for some number of years, and most recently, I think it's about 3 years now with Deloitte. Maybe it's the second year. But
2 years.
Sorry, 2.
2 years, yeah.
Yeah, two. Okay, that makes sense. But yeah, so it was BC for a couple of years after federal government, then 2 years delay, yeah. But yeah, there's a lot of moving puzzle pieces in the public sector in Canada, just like there is in Australia, just like there is everywhere. And it seems the government data Canada's prosperous future is about forming that picture from those puzzle pieces and kind of getting an idea of what we should be looking at. Jaimie, I will go to you. I will stop sharing. And I'd like everyone to please welcome Jaimie.
Thank you, Jaimie.
There we go.
Thanks.
That's
Thank you so
all right,
much,
golf
Stephen, for
cups.
having me. It's a real pleasure to be connecting with the Link Digital team and with this community about one of my favorite topics. Since we're amongst friends, I'm going to be super candid. We started writing this report at least partly out of frustration. I'm a partner within Deloitte Canada, specifically within Deloitte Digital. We're Canada's largest consulting firm. Deloitte Digital is the part of the firm that works with clients across Canada to build wonderful digital service experiences. We're tech agnostic for the most part. We've got a large part of our business that does SaaS implementations, but where I live in our studio, we do end-to-end service design, human-centered design, strong bias towards equity-centered design. We've got a suite of product owners and a fairly robust engineering team. So we do quite a bit of custom development, custom integrations also. I've been in this role for about 2 years, and it's been interesting to see the kinds of questions that we're getting from the client base. In my role, I serve public sector clients across Canada, and I've been working in and around government data my whole career. By training, I'm an economist, and that's how I got into the world of open data. I got sick of cleaning data. That's what I was spending most of my time doing. To do any kind of reasonable analytics within the federal family, we need to spend a lot of time doing data standards. And so when I went over to the Treasury Board Secretary, it was for the purpose of essentially maturing open.canada.ca, the Government of Canada's open data portal, and making sure that it was fit for purpose. We had a new government that had come in at the time, and we put in place the Government of Canada's policy on results that came into effect in 2016. And I remember reading that and thinking, this is fabulous, data-driven decision-making and all that. How on earth are we going to do this if we don't have better data? And so we ended up spending a lot of time working on data quality. And the conversation has evolved, and in some cases in very exciting ways. We have clients that show up and they want to talk about Gen AI, they want to talk about predictive analytics, they want to talk about all sorts of fabulous things. And we find time and time again that we're having to say, yes, and how's your data maturity? We'll build all that, but we don't want to build you something that is going to essentially turn into a zombie app that you won't know how to maintain, that won't have effective inputs, that's going to be a legacy product as soon as we finish building it. And so we spend a lot of time talking about that data maturity. And so that was exactly the genesis of the report. In an age when everybody's excited about sort of next generation data projects of all types, what can we do to systematize data stewardship and effective data management so that we can spend our creative juices on sort of those higher value activities? So that's really why we wrote the report. I'll walk you through the findings. I'm going to try to be fairly brief so that we can get into a conversation. This just formally launched yesterday, so we're just starting to get feedback and thoughts and whether or not it's a useful framework. But really it's almost like for this audience it's going to feel rudimentary because it's intended to almost be a 101 so that the experts on this call, so that you can work your magic. When our government clients, when our government partners have that great data stewardship in place, we can do a lot of the other things that we like to do far more effectively. Okay, so I'm going to share a screen here. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. So here we go with the report. And hopefully you've even got subtitles. I'm trying to be more accessible. Okay, so what we're going to do in the next 5-10 minutes or so, we're going to talk a little bit about the vision that's implicit in the report, why we wrote this thing. And it really is about supporting governments across Canada and around the world to try to leverage data assets that belong to all of us as taxpayers to help steward a more prosperous future that is more inclusive, that is data informed, all of those sorts of things. To get to that more prosperous future, if you will, we think that there are real opportunities to optimize how governments are today managing and stewarding their data. And really, this report offers a series of nine considerations for trying to do that as effectively as possible. And part of the intent is that when people say, okay, I love all this stuff that I'm reading about in the news, where do I get started? You don't have to spend a huge amount of time saying, consider this, consider that. Just send them the report. Here is a way for you to get started right now in terms of building your data maturity. So it's almost like a beginner's guide to data stewardship for the 21st century. Bit about myself. Stephen already gave me a lovely introduction, so thank you for that. But I'm essentially a person who's worked in data and digital for all of my career, either at the subnational level or national level, and today as a consultant. So let's get into the thick of it. The current state, where we started in terms of our understanding of the data environment, is essentially that there's been good progress. If we go back even 10 years ago, I think there was a lot of conversation about, oh, right, we have data. What should we do about it? What we've seen is, at least in the last 5 or 10 years, we've seen not a first generation of data strategies, but a second generation. And I think everybody in the public sector has a recognition that data is a critical asset, and there's been pretty good progress. Most governments have some sort of data discovery. They have some sort of office accountable for this stuff. Really, positive things that I think we would all recommend to friends and clients. What we're seeing, however, is that as the volume of data continues to grow, we are not necessarily seeing continued investments in the maturity, right? So we're seeing that there has been that groundwork, that foundational level, data portals. I'm sure you've been doing lots of great business, but we are seeing that when we are talking about, decentralized approaches to identity, for example, or, use of algorithms, we aren't necessarily seeing progress in data maturity that keeps pace. And that is undermining our ability to be really proactive in leveraging data for service delivery. And that, in turn, we would argue, has an effect on trust. So the vision that underpins this report is that governments can and should more effectively harness the public sector data that they have for the purpose of optimizing service delivery. What does that look like in practice? Well, great intent, but there are a number of gaps. And I'm going to walk you through the gaps that we identify through our engagement with government data leaders. Essentially, there are 3 buckets of gaps. And the first is around effective, having good data in the first place, managing it in a way that elicits trust, and then being future ready. And yes, these are a little bit jargony, but we wanted to have these sort of buckets so that we can effectively say, oh, where does this fit, and sort of have a mental model. So within the just have good data, the challenge here is that in many cases, there are lots of data assets, but they aren't necessarily aligning with data standards. We're getting more and more digital professionals. We're getting easier to deploy digital tools, low code deployments, that sort of thing. And in many cases, we're seeing that these digital tools that are being put in place are not aligning with tested data standards. So a great one to point out would be the open contracting data standard, well-established data standard. The number of procurement systems globally that align with that data standard is really, really low. Like there are maybe 4 of them globally. And so we've invested in data standards, but we don't necessarily have systems that align with those standards, which undermines the ability to have those sort of clear and predictable supplies of data. Safeguarding trust. Data is evolving in terms of the frequency with which it's used, all that sort of thing. Investments in things like digital equity have not kept pace. And so we are using, I think, often almost these facile definitions of what builds trust. And so this has real repercussions for underserved or marginalized communities. So there seems to be opportunities to do that much more effectively. And then the last one is around being future ready. Again, there are great and exciting things that we can do, for example, with algorithms. If you're starting to think about putting guardrails in place or ethical frameworks in place, after you started building the algorithm, you're too late. And so being truly proactive and using data to do things like put in place a tell us once framework or tailored government services for different segmented population groups, that's the sort of thing that we need to be thinking through and creating frameworks for. So given these three categories of gaps, we've also got a suite of recommendations that align with those. So that first gap was around having good data. The recommendations there for this group are going to be sort of, I would say, fairly obvious. Putting in place a culture of data stewardship. So just as an example, when we were in the government of Canada, we spent quite a bit of time identifying an individual data steward per data asset. And these had to be named resources, not just a generic inbox, because that sense of ownership, in the same way that we espouse that culture of product ownership in the digital space, we need to have data ownership so that you can have the ongoing maintenance of data assets. It's not costless to improve the quality of data. Again, in many cases, we would have data assets in a government setting that didn't have rudimentary things, no data dictionary, no documentation around which standard it's aligning with, that sort of thing. It is not costless to deal with that. So really having a good sense of what are the high priority data sets. Are they the most used? Are they critical for a certain decision-making process? Understanding what those high priority data sets are and investing in those. Thinking about who needs to have the data. We've seen a lot of progress around things like citizen experience platforms, DIA, for example, in Ukraine. And solutions like that are predicated on having a really effective data layer. So in the DIA case, it's the Trumbita data system. Fabulous. That would be challenging to deploy in a Canadian context because we haven't necessarily been as proactive as we might around things like effective data sharing. And then the sort of other bucket of potential action around having good data is doing it on a collaborative basis, collaborating with other levels of government, other communities of practice like this one, and really taking that ecosystem approach. Second bucket of gaps that we identified is around safeguarding trust. Again, none of this should be earth-shattering, but really it's ensuring that things like ethical frameworks are continuously updated. A number of us within the G20 have endorsed the GPAI. Fabulous, great to see that progress early on, but we need to be continuously evolving those ethical frameworks as the technology evolves. Same goes with the governance, really ensuring that there are community-based approaches to ensuring inclusion. A great example is out of the government of British Columbia, the government I previously served. There's new legislation effective last year around the collection of race-based data. So being proactive about understanding what are the needs of the population and then documenting that and going towards that sort of rules as code type thinking is really, really critical. A third bucket of activity that we really need to think about is being future ready. So thinking about how might these data assets be as effectively used as possible for the purpose of optimizing services. I feel like everybody needs to be thinking hard about tell us once type principles. How are we ensuring interoperability? And when a data field is updated, how are we making sure that that cascades across the system to ensure that seamless life event style service delivery? Data literacy, upskilling, making sure that there isn't just a pocket of expertise that is housed perhaps in a central agency, in a Treasury Board Secretariat, for example, making sure that you have a healthy talent pipeline, that you aren't segmenting too much between the world of IT and the world of business. Those sorts of things are going to be absolutely critical. And so altogether, then, we've got this suite of 9 steps that governments can and probably should be considering if they want to collectively enhance their data maturity, and on that basis drive better insights, better service delivery, and ultimately more prosperity. I'll leave it there. If you scan that QR code, it'll take you straight to the report. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear reactions. Was this too rudimentary? Is this something that, as you're talking with your government clients, would this resonate? I'd just love to hear any candid feedback from a community of like-minded people.
Do we have hands? I've got some questions or sort of thoughts, but I don't want to spoil the pure waters before anyone else might jump in, or otherwise I will. Okay. My key question. So we link again through Andrew's work as well. We reviewed the data and digital strategy from the Digital Transformation Agency recently, and there are a couple of things that we found sort of lacking there. One of them was around a values framework around the strategy, kind of really grounding what we're doing with data and digital within government for citizens, or for the things that we believe are important to democracies, for example, or well-being or happiness, our future prosperity. One of the things I notice a lot in whether it's consultants or internal reviews or just the language of government is that some of those social words or some of those social things get dropped and replaced. And I'm just wondering, is that might be something that sort of comes across in this document a little bit from my point of view, but again, I turn the waters a little. So words like democracy and safeguarding democracy can then get turned into cybersecurity and trusted institutions. Other things can be like individual agency, the ability to have full control over your life to the extent that good things that should happen to you are not inhibited by the world around you, and bad things that shouldn't happen to you aren't enforced by the world around you. Like that kind of positive agency that protects you from bad, digital harms or digital goods are kind of aligned in the right direction for you. Mm-hmm. Those sort of things often come up in the conversations around, civil society or civic-minded folk, but they kind of get distilled away out of a lot of government documents and kind of government reviews and approaches. How did you guys tackle that? I mean, did it come up? Is it a concern, or is it just?
Yeah, it's a great comment, and particularly in an environment where we're increasingly using the language from the private sector. You take the December 2020, executive order that came out of the US government. It's an executive order on customer experience. Who on earth is the customer that we're talking about here, right? Yeah. Oh, no, it's the people of the United States. And they go and they prioritize five areas to improve the CX. The veterans return to civilian life, for example. Yeah, you can certainly think about applying a CX lens. That language to me, like, I'm not going to be precious about it because I find it almost entirely semantic, and I'd rather people do the right thing than talk about the right thing. Like watch the hands, not the mouth. Yep. At the same time, I do find it kind of troubling that we're dealing with humans as widgets, as customers. And so, yeah, I would say that is an area of concern. More broadly, maybe I'm sensitive about it because of the Andreessen article, but this sense of techno-optimism is something that we need to be cautious about. Yes, I'm a technologist. Yes, I am proudly a technologist, and I believe wholeheartedly in the power of digital. I only believe in it to the extent that it means that my mom is going to get her old age security more easily, and that kid who's going through foster care is going to get access to his or her own data. That's why we show up at work, in my view. So that service imperative is absolutely critical. There's an interesting anecdote that came up recently. I've done quite a bit of writing and thinking about the notion of tailored government services and design around life events. Right. And so the notion of, somebody showing up and they're pregnant and then, they go and they check in to have the baby, like, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to anticipate that they may at some point want a birth certificate. Right. And so the notion of cascading government services is something that we can extrapolate from and apply to many different life events. And I guess somebody was skeptical, and I was giving them the example of TELUS once from the UK. They were in an environment where when somebody passed away, you had an imperative to tell 41 different government agencies that your loved one had passed away. And so very poor customer experience, if you will. But the benefit to government is not just serving the people better when you go to a TELUS Once policy. They also found over £20 million in annual savings and vestigial benefit payments. Right. And so I think that notion of designing around the human experience and doing so in an empathetic and inclusive way is absolutely the reason we do any of this work around data management. So, yes, so I violently agree with you, Stephen.
Cool. Well, Andrew's got a question, so you go.
Yeah, I
Andrew.
mean, yes to a tell us once policy, having had to tell 41 government agencies that a parent has passed away, absolutely. What I'm interested in, just taking it out of the frame of what you're talking about a little bit, because Stephen's mentioned that our government has a data and digital strategy it's trying to pursue. And I think one of the things that strikes me, as someone who is much newer to this sector than I think you are, is the automatic assumption that this is all a good thing. That digital government services, I mean, they are a good thing, but this assumption that everyone will think that digital government services is a good thing, rather than, I think, the perception of a lot of people in the community that actually they just live in this black box, that they don't understand what's going on, there's no way around it, they don't understand digital services, they don't necessarily understand how to access them. And they might have had very negative experiences with some of the, tentative forays that they've had into that area. And I'm just interested in the Canadian context, what has been going on to deal with that group of people who I don't think are a small group of people, but who we really never ever talk about.
Yeah, it's actually quite a large group of people.
I think so too. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't generally collect much data on them. So, Canada, G7 country, you would expect us to know about our digital equity issues. It ends up we were using UK and US data until last year when we went out and Deloitte Digital did primary research on this topic to understand what does digital equity look like in Canada. And we found that the barriers to digital inclusion are far more entrenched and pernicious than we ever would have imagined. The definition that we'll typically use in Canada for digital equity will be one around access. We have a urban-rural divide, and so we say, well, the urban people have easy access and the rural people have slow bandwidths, and that's that. And it ends up that definition is entirely useless in an environment where actually we have fairly severe issues in terms of skill sets. Our elderly population not only does not feel confident doing anything digitally, over half of Canadian elders don't know who to ask to get help digitally. So it's, we've got elder isolation, for example. Another really alarming stat from that research was around the ecosystems that surround those digital experiences. If you are Indigenous in Canada, you are over twice as likely to get bullied online as somebody from European descent. And so how excited are you going to be to go and deal with your government or get educated or, buy something or fall in love in an environment where you're getting bullied? And so that notion of digital equity being about access, we thought was totally narrow-minded. And it's instead digital access, but also participation and an ecosystem that you can trust and thrive in. And so that more expansive definition is not something that has been fully bought into yet. And it means that in many cases, we have almost this, a default towards digital that can be quite challenging. We did a project a few years ago around old age security. And again, amongst friends, there was a desire for us to see if we could do website improvements around different benefits to the elderly population. And based on ethnographic research, going out and doing that human-centered design work, what people really wanted was not a new website. They wanted, I'm going to show that I grew up in the 80s and 90s, they wanted a Cosmo quiz. I don't know if anybody remembers that or if that was only something that the women were looking at. But, when you put your finger on the page and it's like, if yes, then this, if no, then that, people wanted to know, am I eligible? If I'm eligible, I'll call my grandkid, I'll talk to my neighbor, I'll jump the hoops. But first, I want to know, am I eligible? And these very basic human design questions are things that we'll sometimes overlook because, we took that digital 101 course and we're like, oh, great, I just need to implement a CRM and off I go. And it's like, no, that's not where we need to start. We need to start by understanding the diverse and unique needs of the people we're trying to serve.
So how has Canada tried to put that into practice, or is that a work in progress?
Oh, very much a work in progress. I
Right.
mean, we've been a work in progress for ages. I think that there's a growing level of maturity around the notion that we cannot be digital only. That it's good and appropriate to be digital first, but those people who do not have a preference for being digital should be served by humans in person on the phone, and those humans who are serving them should have great digital supports, right? So the example would be, let's use my mom, an elderly person, cannot do anything on the computer to save her life. She's going to phone in if she needs to do anything with her government. The person who answers the phone should have excellent digital supports. She should not get a different answer depending on the day of the week that she phones. She should not have to leave a voicemail that then gets inputted into some, an Excel on SharePoint to be responded to at some point 3 weeks later. We should have excellent supports for those employees. And so I think that would maybe be my one sort of my biggest piece of feedback. It would be a recognition to design not just around the diversity of our people, but to also design around the needs of the internal user, so that those government employees who are providing the frontline services, they can be as efficient as possible using digital tools. It's appropriate for us to have an expectation that public servants be able to use digital tools. Not all Canadians, though. Would you agree?
Oh, totally, completely. I was just, yes, that makes a lot of sense what you're saying. Absolutely.
What would be like the potential advantages of Indigenous communities having greater control over their data?
Well, I mean, it'd be an excellent step towards basic tenets of reconciliation to start with. I'm not Indigenous, so I won't pretend to speak for any of the communities here. But I will say that based on some of the findings from organizations in Canada, like the First Nations Information Governance Center, there are massive steps to be taken towards the principles of effective ownership, control, access, and protection. If this is an area of interest, FNIGC, the organization I just mentioned, has a fabulous course on the OCAP principles. When I was at Treasury Board Secretariat federally, every single one of the members of our open government and open data teams went through that training because I thought it was absolutely critical, and they loved it. And so the notion that we are potentially making decisions about communities using data that they can't even see, like, it's unbelievably exploitative in my view. And so I think that having, understanding how communities want data about them to be managed is good and appropriate.
I got a question about digital tools versus democratic tools. Are there examples or points of pressure in Canada you're seeing where the nature of our digital lives and our information space is putting enough pressure back onto government to say, well, maybe we need to change our democratic processes a little bit to protect citizens? Examples might be things like citizens' assemblies on particular policy issues or approaches, expert panels, rather than going to the broad public, because the broad public in the information space or the infosphere can easily be manipulated by external parties or biased parties. And I guess the other thing I see is that potential misdirection. But when these things come up, so in Australia, we had a referendum recently, and there's a lot of complaint toward the media and how the media addressed the fundamental questions and giving airtime to different views and all this kind of stuff. And it's a little bit of a misdirection. It's pointing at the media and saying, there is a fault there, and very likely is, but that should create a bit more pressure back onto the democratic processes themselves. We should be thinking a bit more hard on the harder issue, which is how do we run these processes in a sanitized and informed space, and that might come with a little bit more control. So there are software tools, for example, in the digital space that allow you to run debates with verifiable claims, with refutable claims, and like literally a debate platform where people can upvote the claims that made pro or against particular points. And those sorts of things seem really interesting to me. I'm wondering if those sorts of democratic tools are being raised in Canada as improvements.
Yeah, not really. I mean, there have been little nascent pockets of innovation. Citizen assemblies, for example, we've seen some pockets of that. We also had a few misfires. So, for example, yeah, I think it's been fairly well publicly documented that there was a significant amount of pushback on some of the activities around sidewalk labs in Toronto, the Toronto waterfront. So we've had some experiments with these kinds of tools, but nowhere near, like, you take Taiwan's experimentation with the GovZero movement, like we're nowhere near that. Where I would highlight some good leadership out of Canada is in having a fairly decent understanding within our digital community of the difference between quantitative and qualitative research. Right. So the notion of going out and saying, okay, I'm going to use national statistics or national accounts to inform my digital policy design or my digital program. I think that there is a general understanding that the average Canadian is non-existent. We're a nation of immigrants. We're one of the largest countries in the world. We're incredibly diverse. And so designing for the average is a relatively futile process. And in fact, within my practice, within Deloitte Digital, if you think of the bell curve of what is normal, if you will, so often in digital product delivery, we'll design around the mean. And we've actually found that that's often a silly choice. And we sort of say, well, design for the 80 and then the 20, we'll figure it out. We'll add features, whatever. And we actually take the opposite approach. We'll design for the 20. And we find that when we design for the marginal user, if you will, that generally comes from underserved communities, the majority is still able to use the service, right? And it's sort of inspired from the accessibility community. Like we talk about, excuse me, the old sidewalks. They used to have a very rigid curb. And it was like, no, we have to have slanted curves so that people in wheelchairs can get around. And it's like, yes, it's necessary for the person in the wheelchair. It's also really convenient for the person with a shopping buggy or the kid in the stroller or the suitcase or whatever else they might be dragging down the sidewalk. So we find that the same sort of philosophy applies fairly well in the digital world, where if we design for people who have perhaps more extreme needs, we're often still able to serve the vast majority of people. And so that sort of thinking requires, I think, fairly deep qualitative research inspired by human-centered design. So there, I think we've seen some good progress and an understanding of the nuance there. In terms of using sort of more innovative democratic tools, citizen assemblies, doing that on a widespread basis. We've seen a little bit at the community level, like municipalities, less so at on a pan-Canadian basis.
Yeah, okay. And so the question comes from somewhere, I guess. It was going to be my talking point, but I'm very happy to just have questions and go more like this. So the experience I had going to OGP Estonia was just recognizing how important consultative practices were with citizens around good policy formation and open government in general. It was sort of like a flavor that I hadn't really noticed as strongly in previous OGPs. And I also saw it as a really leveling thing as well, because we see in, I guess, mature liberal democracies at the moment, it's an onslaught of misinformation and disinformation. So it's no longer just for the developing economies that are, being beaten down by this sort of activity. It's happening to all of us. But the kind of idea of going in what your report talks about, it was a data-driven policy, right? I see policy as coming from two spaces. One is either a politician wants to make promises to constituents and get voted in. So maybe it's around water security. They want those promises to be aligned with their party so that their party will actually get power and get into government. And then they'll want their ministry or agency to deliver programs in alignment with that policy that will ultimately close the loop maybe 4 to 8 years later and get them re-elected and get their party re-elected. That's a really long process. And so that kind of democratic process around policy development is very subject to misinformation, disinformation tactics.
Mm-hmm.
Misinformed populations, voting in the wrong people under the wrong promise making with under-delivered promises in the delivery. However, from government, you can have policy proposals coming from an agency that's responsible for water security. If they have good data holdings, and they have, like in Australia, we have the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, as an example. And Canada has other basins and watersheds where there's good data. So the policy can come from the ground up, recommendation based. And I think that's really one of the strong ways we can improve our democratic process by being, our policies coming more from government operations. Is that a direction that might work in Canada?
I think it might. And I agree with most of what you've just said. Because my only layer to put on top of that is I think that it's incumbent upon those of us who are sort of public interest technologists, let's call us, to recognize the cost of participation. In an ideal world, I would love for everybody to be participating in all policy development, and let's have this inclusive and vibrant democracy. And, we also have an interest rate situation where more and more Canadians are working 2 jobs, and we're struggling to pay for housing, and we've got an opioid crisis. And in that environment, it is not costless to participate in these policy development processes. Just yesterday, I was reviewing an RFP where they want human-centered designers to go in and understand how people are experiencing homelessness and their use of metro stations as sort of last-ditch housing. And what are the digital supports that might help in that environment? And I'm sitting there going, oh my goodness, how on earth am I going to do this research? We need to compensate people. You're sitting trying to chat with somebody who's living on the street and saying, hey, would you inform me about your experience? You got to pay them. Like you can't just show up and say, tell me about your experience. It's wildly exploitative, I think, for us to, as digital natives, as designers of whatnot, to say, hey, tell me about your views, tell me about your lived experience. So yeah, I agree. There should be more participation. I also think that we need to be conscious of, in a Westminster style democracy, we have these crude implements for identifying people that we elect and represent us. They're getting recognition. How do we make it exciting? How do we build an incentive structure for people to be genuinely desiring to be implicated in some of the processes you're describing?
Awesome. Fantastic.
This was fun.
Questions. Let me look at my notes. Data mesh, that's a thing. So there's a good crossover with data mesh and CCAN. This is another bias of mine, because we've had customers talking about the general access models to data sets. In government, it's kind of my belief or my observance that it's less of a technical question sometimes, how to access the data, more of a governance question. Who controls the data? Who's the custodian? What kind of confidence can I have in this data? All of those surrounding contextual questions are kind of part of the interoperability of that data. So the data mesh concept as a non-technical concept can almost be fulfilled by something like CCAN, because it provides a lot of that external information. And then just adding to that would be the programmatic interface through to whatever data storage platform. When you guys talk about data mesh, what kind of tooling or what kind of components would a data mesh have? Depending on how far you want to go into that question.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, it would be, again, coming back to the service imperatives, right? Like, why are we putting in place any kind of data fabric across government for the purpose of service outcomes? I think that in many cases where we've started deploying these sort of data fabric type approaches, we've had to make updates to privacy, security, that sort of thing, to ensure that there is compliance. When we do that sort of thing and we put in place a slightly more permissive privacy kind of framework, how are we continuing to safeguard privacy? So there has to be a whole lot of education. The software that's available to us to do this kind of work is better and better every day. You know, Snowflake, AWS, like all of the major providers have fabulous tools that are easier and easier to deploy. What I get worried about is if we go ahead and deploy these sorts of things, is there going to be effective use of this powerful highway, you know, that we're putting in place in an environment where there may not be full clarity around things like the security and operations of the applications that make use of that data. You know, when I was in the government of BC, and this is all in the public domain, we went and put together a hosting and application development framework based on the discovery that most of our applications were not maintained. Like over 80% of the apps powering government services had less than 6 users. Most of them had not had a net new investment in over 3 years. And we all know that if you don't invest in an app for 3 years, it's probably got some security issues with it, right? Like these maintenance issues and just the sort of how we maintain government digital assets is pretty critical. So I think those are the sorts of considerations I would put in place. Like, should we have effective data fabrics across government? Yes, absolutely. But we also need to maintain it and make effective use of that investment.
Yeah. So we should go to Cherry, but I just want to add to that. So digital public infrastructure based on digital public goods, and maybe adopting standards for public code. I would say there's some real alignment in those 3 items, those 3 directions for government in the future. But Cherry, what's your question?
Look, I'm on the, I guess, consumer side of this. So I was the enterprise data steward at the NRMA, which is for the Canadian, I didn't know what the Canadian equivalent is. In the US, it would be the AAA. But we're in mutual owned by our members in about half the households in the States. And then I moved on to being the head of data governance at CoreLogix, the big real estate data company. So we're both a consumer and a supplier to government in both of those contexts. And a lot of the moves that I was seeing from government are heartwarmingly wonderful. Things like there's now an Australian death notice registry where organizations that frequently would need to be notified can automatically be notified by the government. So essentially saving that person having to make 18 different actually probably more like 50 different phone calls to discuss their mother's death over and over and over again with complete strangers. So being able to shortcut that process, I think, is a marvelous thing. And in so many cases, more open data is just a benefit to everyone, but the risks around it are really worrying. And I always tried to actually bring things back to the risk of sounding like a corporate drone to user stories, essentially. So one of the I struggled a lot to make sure that the right fabric was in place to protect domestic violence victims while still making paths through notifying people of deaths easier, I guess, and to educate my own end users and, call center operators and whatever else on keeping a balance between those 2 things. And I never found a particularly repeatable and scalable method for doing that, I guess. So how I get data governance to be real, because I honestly, I hate the term. I hate the fact that you take 2 words that bore most people to tears, put them together, and then try to get people invested and engaged. And I just, when you're at a barbecue and someone says, "What do?" And you say data governance, they really don't want to hear any more about that, right? So, I spent a lot of time with things like my call centers, getting training out there saying, this is how we are protecting the very real individuals that you guys love and care about, right? That the reason for me, getting them on board always came to making it human, right? Because I did find no matter how many controls you put in place, people will find ways around them if they don't buy into what you're doing and why you're doing it. As a simple example, we had monthly payment plans. You weren't allowed to sell a monthly payment plan unless you had a mobile number and an email address. And I had call centers putting in fake ones. We did a lot more to identify fake ones, but then they'd start putting in, say, their own mobile number so that they could respond to it and verify the number, because the person who wanted to buy the thing didn't want to give a mobile number. And I was saying, okay, the problem is you're now tapping into their bank account, but you're not being able to communicate to them to warn them that you're about to tap their bank account, right? So I know you're trying to make it easy for them, but you're actually setting them up for bounce checks and bank fees and things that are going to upset them. So your good intentions are not having the result you want them to have. But I don't know. I'd never found a great way to scale that, I guess. And I'd be sort of interested in your take on it, because I do still think I was on the right track, that making it human, bringing it back to the individual is the only way to make it resonate across the organization.
I totally agree. Couldn't agree more. I'll share just a very brief story from the government of British Columbia. One of our more successful data initiatives was called the Data Innovation Program. And there's if you Google Government of BC Data Innovation Program, you'll find some content on it. Something we sort of one of our dirty, not so secret secrets in British Columbia, more people died during COVID from opioid overdoses than from COVID. It is an absolutely massive health crisis for our jurisdiction. And so you go into an environment where we're talking about, hey, like, can we do anything from a data perspective to understand this problem, to do some predictive work to save lives? And so that was really the problem that we were trying to solve. And really, what could be more important for somebody who knows a bit about data, who maybe joined a government because they wanted to have a good impact on our communities? And it's like, hey, like, let's get over our silos. And so it was essentially a measure to put in place an environment that was safe for gray data that we wanted to release because of the research benefits, but that through the mosaic effect could be incredibly damaged if there was any kind of aggregation or re-identification of an individual. Kids in care, that's the same sort of data. You never, like, data on kids in care is never going to be a candidate for release as open data, right? And so creating an environment for that gray data, anonymize it to the nth degree, absolutely, like, do all those provisions, but then can we create secure environments? So in this case, it was through a partnership between the government, the provincial government, and the public university, so the University of British Columbia. Pop Data BC is the name of the initiative there. And it was a secure sandbox environment. Accredited researchers could apply to get clearance to access that anonymized data in that secure environment. And I think that that's an incredible initiative that strikes a balance between what you're describing, the imperative of having sound data management, with the human imperative of, hey, there are people dying of opioid overdoses on our streets. Can we do something about this? Use what little gray matter we might have between the ears to try to make ourselves a little bit healthier as a society. So that's the approach I've always taken. Can we tell a story about the data? Can we tell a story of impact of healthier communities, or at least less sick communities? And that, at least for me, has been a useful way of drawing attention.
That's an awesome answer. I'll just add a couple of minutes or 1 minute sub answer as well, from a very boring economic point of view, supply and demand. So I've noticed when government is just supplying open data, it can get to a point where it's not really met with demand. And then you have this like thinly traded market. And in such a market, there's easy opportunity for bad things to occur, because people just kind of aren't paying attention. So the data governance, as it were, comes into that scenario: checks and balances, make sure that we're looking after places, make sure that we're cleaning, tidying, maintaining. But when it's a heavily traded market, then I hate to say it, it turns into more like customer experience management, right? Because you've got a demand side that you're addressing, you're going to start looking at the challenges of meeting that demand side. So as long as your open data program is tightly connected to your policies and your delivery of citizen services and your engagement with citizens and your feedback mechanisms and your success metrics and how you're measuring the direction of your policies towards the objectives they should be pursuing, then your open data program is going to be quite successful, I think. around that. So it sounds, Sherry, like you were doing the right thing. You're basically being an advocate for your customers. You're trying to work out all the problems before they emerged, categorize them and resolve them. And I think that if that isn't data governance in a more attractive set of wording, yeah, I don't know what is.
I would love to see the whole industry just come up with a new name for it, to be honest. People would see me coming and say, oh no, she's going to give us a giant checklist of boxes we have to tick that are all meaningless and effortful.
So we could call it DGX, Data Governance Experience, DGX. I'm conscious of time. People are going to start dropping. This has been awesome, Jaimie. Thank you so much for coming and occupying all of our time and allowing me at least to ask way too many questions. Thanks to everyone else coming along. Jaimie will be at Canadian Open Data Summit. I'll be there. There's going to be cool stuff going on. I encourage everyone to check out the document from Deloitte. Lots of cool talking points, lots of things to delve into and research for yourselves as it crosses over into your own work as well. And as for
Thanks
my
so much for having me, Stephen.
I'll put something in the memo. Yeah, anytime, come back.
Fabulous. And hopefully I'll see many of you in my hometown in Victoria. It's so special to get all these wonderful global leaders visiting us talking about open data.
Cool. And I'll be there. I think Lex will be there as well.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'll be there.
Fabulous.
Everyone. We'll catch you later.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Great
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.